So hello and welcome everyone to Office Hours with me. I am Eileen Cook. Today is February 20th. I just double checked that, so I'm right. And this is our happy hour session for Wednesday morning. Today I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about what makes for a good first chapter. I will also warn people I will end just a little bit early today, and that is because I'm excited to announce I have bought a shiny new condo. So I put an offer in on a place which has been accepted, and now we are in the middle of scrambling to get all these various things done. And of course, the only time someone can talk to me is 9:45. But that's fine because I have sage wisdom I can impart in the time that we have. So this question actually came up because someone was talking to me about what makes for a good first page. And so we're all always desperately trying to have a good first page. But I thought it would be actually helpful to sort of expand out a little bit and talk about what makes for a good first chapter. So I trolled around on various agent websites, Writer's Digest website, and kind of coalesced all their information together. And basically the same points came up again and again, although sometimes people called them different things, but they were basically the same points. So those are the things we're going to focus on. So the first thing that I sort of came up with was an analogy, and people who know me know I love me a good analogy. So the analogy that I want to get is that your first chapter is sort of like the feeling that someone gets when they walk into a restaurant. You're trying to set the tone and the feel of what's about to come. So if you walk into a restaurant and there are white linen tablecloths that are, starched to the 9th degree, and 12 pieces of cutlery on each individual place setting, and crystal glasses, and the paintings on the wall are actual real oil paintings, and all of the waiters and wait staff are in the, starched black with the very crisp uniforms, you have a sense of what it is that you're about to get before any food is even put down on your plate. You already know. In the same way, if you go into a restaurant and there's a ukulele hanging on the wall, and all the pictures are posters of like dogs playing poker, and the wait staff comes over and they have all the weird jokey buttons pinned to their uniform, you have again a very different idea of what kind of food experience you're going to have as you go into it. And your first chapter is a bit like that. You're trying to set up for people a feeling about what they're going to have. So what do you want to have? So the very first thing that came up sort of universally is you want to have either a great first line or a great first paragraph, preferably both. So why is that? And that is truly because that is someone's first bite of food. So that's the very first thing that they are tasting, and you want it to sort of blow their mind and sort of set them up. And I know that puts a ton of pressure on people. So I think the biggest thing is not to worry about having that as you start, but knowing that when you're going back and revising, you will be looking with that. I was teaching for SFU last night, and one person, part of what, sparked this for me is we were talking about, she was asking if her first chapter worked well. And for all of us, the line that she had in on the third paragraph was perfect. It was sort of hysterically funny. It set the tone. It had all these great feels. It put you perfectly in all these places. So we were suggesting that she open with that line. So again, when you're writing, don't worry about if your initial draft, you don't feel like you have the winner first line. It might be in there a few paragraphs later, or you might have to massage it, but you're looking for something. And part of that also comes, I don't know how many of you have had this experience, but you go to a bookstore, you see a book, it's got an interesting cover, and yes, you have judged the book by its cover, damn you, right? You pick it up, you read the inside flap, you're like, okay, that sounds interesting, and then you flip and you read that first paragraph, and how often, like, it may not necessarily sell the book, but a really great first paragraph does. Like, you read that and you're like, yep, you snap it shut, you're like, that's it, I'm going to read this book. And if it doesn't have that, you might still buy the book because you're still intrigued enough with the blurb or everything else, but that can really go a long way. So spending time on that first paragraph, that's going to pull people in. The second most common piece of advice came up about having a compelling character in that opening chapter. This is almost always, though not, as soon as you try and say always, like there are a few people that said always and then they were corrected, it's almost always your main character. And some people will actually feel cheated. You will see some books that open with one character and, for example, they die at the end of that chapter, and then the second chapter opens with who's going to actually be the main character. And I can feel Leslie sweating because she has a character that dies in a chapter that I'm reading. But he doesn't die off as a character. He remains. He's just a ghost. So I think that is a different kettle of fish. So I will relieve Leslie from any sweating she might be doing as I'm talking. But for other people, thinking about who you open with and grounding the reader in that is really useful. And that is because that's the person that is almost taking the hand of your reader and saying, okay, let's go on this adventure together. So the reader is sort of trained and naturally feels this connection to wanting to be hooked up with a character. So thinking about that. So I know there's going to be the thought or the debate, do I have to like that main character? And we've had this conversation around other points. Not necessarily. There are people who make very intriguing, fascinating characters that you want to read about regardless if we like them. But in general, most authors are starting us off with a character that we're going to find interesting or a character that we're going to want to sort of follow. Yes. So Scott's talking about like the idea where you have a prologue where there's a character that's not the main character. And that's, I think, why you'll often see it pulled out as a prologue versus chapter 1, is that people get attached to characters. So if you kill them off right after you first introduce them, they can get irritated by that because they sort of feel like it's that first date where you have high expectations. So they're thinking this is someone they're going to spend some time with, and then that person is gone. So thinking about what can you show about your character that will make them seem compelling. I tend to stay away from the word likable because I do think, at least for myself, I can get pulled in by a character that's not likable, but they have to be fascinating. There has to be something about them that's interesting or that pulls me in. And I think we've talked a little bit before, but things like, is the character in a vulnerable situation will make them potentially more interesting. So Harry Potter is an orphan who, lives with the Dursleys under the staircase. Like right off the bat, we're sort of find ourselves liking him and sort of feeling for him. Or do you have a character that's naturally funny? So those are characters that people sometimes just automatically like a little bit more. Even if they're snarky funny, we still find ourselves sort of intrigued by that. That's what I have working for me. That's why Bonnie's laughing. I may not always be charming, but at least I'm somewhat amusing from time to time. So that is going for me. Or the character has some sort of interesting skill set or something that intrigues us about them that we want to follow. So again, I think you can sort of start thinking about your own stories. And I know I've read quite a few people's work here, right, where there's something about them that for the reader is going to sort of pull me in. The third thing that came up was sort of a tie, but I think that they're very similar, and so I actually made them one together, which is they wanted a strong sense of author voice / a strong sense of the tone of the book. And those two things, I think, go together really quite well. But if you are setting up that this is going to be a comic novel and you open with somebody peeling puppies, and this horrible situation, I think of the worst thing I could imagine. That was it. You're trying to come up with something, it's absolutely horrible. And then after that, it's going to be a funny novel. You're going to lose some people because there's sort of this sense or tone or feel. So if you're trying to make a comic novel setting up some moments of funny, not that the whole chapter has to be laugh out loud, but that we're getting an idea of this is the kind of book that it's going to be. Just setting that feel for it. Is it going to be short, punchy sentences? Is this going to be, long, languid descriptions? Something that will sort of ground us into what that feel is going to be like and who you as the author and what your voice is going to be like. And I think those two things go really well together. Now, one of the things that came up, not quite as much, but was there, was an idea that there was a hint of the theme or whatever the bigger issue of the book was going to be. So if you like at all sort of the story beat kind of things, you'll sort of hear that sometimes there is a beat that people will call theme stated. And that is the idea that some character in the book or the narrator or sort of the omniscient voice in some way actually says what the book is about. So you have two characters joking about the first day of school and what they're going to wear on that first day of school, and they're teasing each other. And one character might say something like, dude, you just got to be who you are, right? And fundamentally, that is what the book is about, is, oh, you have to decide who you are. So oftentimes you'll see a character, although you don't want to have a moment where it's like, and now I shall discuss the theme of this novel. So you're not trying to have that, but you're trying to sort of maybe hint at, this is fundamentally what the book is about. It's about accepting myself, or it's about deciding who you really are, or it's about the idea that beauty is only skin deep, or whatever it is that that theme is maybe hinted at in that first chapter, so that the reader has a sense of what that thing is going to be, even without necessarily being aware that that's what the theme is going to be. So if you are like me, I don't necessarily know what the theme of my book is when I'm writing it, or that's something that I'm sorting out and figuring out as I go along. So give yourself permission, again, because you're going to hear me talk about this a lot, to go back to the beginning once you've finished the book. And now once you've finished the book, you probably have a pretty good idea of what the theme is. And going back to see, like, is there a way to somehow bring that in, either on a much smaller scale, or, you know, as a sort of a comment between two characters, or something that might hint at what this book is actually about, because that will be satisfying to the reader, although they don't necessarily know it at the time. But you're setting them up. So again, if we go back to my restaurant analogy, if you've ever been like in a fancy restaurant where they sometimes will have an amuse-bouche to kind of get you going, and the first thing is that the food generally has some kind of theme. So it's Italian, or it's French, or it's seafood. So it would be very strange if you were at a fancy French restaurant and your amuse-bouche was Dorito chips. Like, it would feel, or salsa and chips, like it would feel odd unless it was, you know, spun. So it was a ceviche and chips. So you were kind of getting the idea of where you were going. So again, that's one way to sort of think about it, is, again, you're trying to sort of set that feel. The next point, number 5, which is guaranteed to drive everybody crazy, which is a bunch of agents said, make sure you're starting in the right place. To which I heard the 1,001 authors in my head go, how do I know what the right place is? This is, again, for me, the idea of, do not worry about this as you're writing. This is something that I think you go back to and you are often revising. And I know this is something Bonnie has been going back and forth with and working on with her dragon story. Sometimes it's perfectly clear, like, you know exactly where the story starts. So when I was writing with Malice, I knew that I wanted to open with her in the hospital with no idea of what happened. Like, I knew that. I did go back and rewrite that first chapter a few times, because in part the chapter opens with her waking up, which is supposedly this huge no-no, and I fought it for a long time and then decided, screw it, I'm breaking that rule and she's going to wake up. But that is something that I went back and forth on and thought on a lot. So give yourself permission to come back to that first chapter when you're all done and decide, where is it that I want to start? Do I want to start with an action scene and then go back, have a flashback to some information that you need? Or do I want to tell the story in a linear fashion? So we're going to start at maybe a scene that's not as quite as action-packed, but I think is really important. You might cut just some amount of information. Again, with the student I was working with last night, she had originally had a different opening scene. It was a contemporary YA about a character who's coming out in her Catholic high school. So she had started initially at a party scene where a character is attracted to someone else. And the challenge that some of us had with that, although we didn't necessarily know it, is there were so many characters being introduced because it was this large party scene that we didn't really feel grounded. And so she ended up changing it and opening the scene, which she worried would be too boring, which was a bunch of the characters driving to the party. But that actually worked better because we felt more grounded in who we needed to be following before we got to the party scene. So when she revised it, we ended up changing that. I've also seen it go the other way where people end up cutting out a lot of stuff that they had at the beginning because they felt that they needed it. Sometimes when you're writing that opening scene, what you're doing is then trying to see if you can have, exactly, says the dog, a full circle scene. So for example, you either want the character to return to the same place. So you'll see that in a lot of stories. So if you think of Elf, it starts in the North Pole with him being teased, and the final scene of Elf is him back at the North Pole, now with his wife and a child. And so we see that he's fully accepted, right? So it is a full circle kind of thing. Lord of the Rings is a full circle where he's starting in the Shire and then returning to the Shire, and we see how different he is. The Hunger Games starts with her in District 12, I think it is, and 9, district something. And she comes back and she's back at the same district, but we see how completely different she is by what she's been through. Sometimes it's the opposite. So you see a character at the beginning, and then we see them in a very different place at the end of that scene, right? So, or at the end of the book. So at the start of Star Wars, you see Luke Skywalker as a farmer on Tatooine in this sandy, dusty, desolate area. And the final scene is him dressed in military garb going up to get his award and in this chrome glass space station-y kind of place, right? So it's a way of, again, showing how different the character is. So when you come to the end of your book and you've had whatever your big scene is, you might be like, oh, I want to go back and show them in the same place, but just now it's different. Or I want to go back and just show how different places that they are. So sometimes that will help you set up a first scene. So that's something to think about. The next one, advice number 6, was to tell the reader where they are, but to not get bogged down in detail. So that's a little bit similar to tone and feel, but it is the idea, like, if this is a space novel, make sure that we know that we're in space. If this is a historical novel, make sure that I know that I'm in a historical place setting, a contemporary place setting, something that will sort of set the tone and feel. So a lot of times, especially if you're writing fantasy, it is the idea of just giving us some hints, like, are dragons walking around up and down the streets? Like, oh, that's a normal thing. Or is this like a medieval town, but it's not? Like, just giving us some sense of the feel. And again, I just think that helps people get grounded. I have picked up books before. Now, it's a little different when you're buying in a bookstore because there's the cover and the back copy blurb, so you're seeing all of that. But again, sometimes when you're querying and sending things out, an agent's just picking up those 5 pages and starting to read. So the sooner that you can make sure that they know kind of where they are, the better they are to hook into the story, because there's nothing worse than sort of reading. And I've had this doing edits where all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wait, this is like the 1800s, right? Like, and I didn't get that quite for the first 2 or 3 paragraphs. So I had sort of an image in my head of what was going on. And then I'm like, oh, wait, this is Downton Abbey. That's completely a different feeling. So anything you can do to sort of ground people in where they are will be helpful. Probably not surprising to anyone who knows me, I included, you need to have conflict in that first chapter. It doesn't have to be the main conflict. So if you're setting up a story that is all about, will you make magic be able to return to this world? That doesn't have to be in that first chapter, but there needs to be some sort of conflict. Don't have a first chapter where people are just sort of like, hello, Natasha, nice to meet you. I'm Eileen. Have you met my friend Leslie? This is Leslie. Oh, up in the corner, we have Scott, who looks like he's developing a headache as he listens to me. And so we're sort of introducing all these characters, but nothing's really happening. Again, you still have to fulfill readers' expectations. They want something to happen. For clarity, and I think it's something that a lot of people get caught on or confused on, is this doesn't have to be the big conflict. Nothing has to blow up. No one has to die. In that first chapter, like, I think sometimes people are so afraid that they've heard, like, you've got to open big. So it's like chapter 1, the school exploded, sort of going on from there. You can have that big flashy opening if that's kind of the tone and feel of your book, but it doesn't have to be, but there does need to be some kind of conflict. So thinking about what will work with that. And then the next and last thing is something to pull the reader along, something that will keep them reading. So if you listen, or if you like Don Moss at all, when he talks about his breakout novel, he's always talking about raising questions that will make the reader want to read more, to want to sort of know what's going to happen in the story, so that there's something where they're like, oh, and then what happens? And then what's going to go on? So you want something that's going to pull them in. Now, of course, I'm going to put my Don Moss hat on, right? And he would say, you want that in every single line, in every paragraph, in every chapter. And yes, you do. But I'm just also going to go on the record, easy for Don to say when he's not writing books, darn it, that I do think that you can have some chapters that are quieter, that are more resting, that you will have some lines that are not necessarily raising that question. But you don't want that in the first bit. The first bit, you really want to make sure that you have kind of strapped the reader in, because once they're on the ride, and I think you guys all know this as well, there is a tipping point as you're reading where all of a sudden you are now engaged in the story and you will keep reading, right? But in the early pages, if the author doesn't tip you in, if you have a large stack of other things to be read, or if you have a lot going on, that's the book that's probably going to go back to the library or get, unfortunately, cycled to the bottom of the to be read pile, and maybe not to return. So I think particularly in that first chapter, and I might even argue the first 2 or 3 chapters, you're really trying to make sure that you've got the reader hooked and that they're going to continue going. So that was 8 points. So a great opening line in a first paragraph, a compelling character, a strong hint of voice or tone, a hint of the theme, starting in the right place, everyone's most annoying thing, telling the reader where they are, a hint of conflict, and something that keeps them reading. So now I'm going to do the world's most annoying thing and use one of my own books as an example. You're welcome. Right, so this is You Owe Me a Murder, which is coming out in a couple weeks. No panic, right? And a note from my editor reminding me that she loved it, which I darn appreciate. So if you were to open to chapter 1, it says, I plotted murder in the Vancouver airport while waiting at gate D78 for my flight to London. That is the first sentence of the book. So what have I hopefully done? Like, with just a line, what I was trying to do is basically have a great opening line that would make someone be like, why is someone plotting murder? Having a little bit of the hint of the tone. So I'm hoping that that reads almost a little bit funny or ironic that you're plotting murder at the airport. Hopefully it makes you interested in that character, like why she would be plotting murder. Again, hint of voice. Hint of theme. Yep, because this book is all about, are you actually capable of committing a murder? So that's what it is about. So I managed to sneak that in. The reader knows where they are. I've actually told you you're at the Vancouver airport. And more precisely, I'm telling you where we're going. Which is, this book does take place in London, England. So I'm switching us over to London, where we're going to do a hint of conflict, hopefully, because we are wanting to commit murder. And so why and what's that about? And hopefully that makes you want to keep reading. So that was line 1.
Can you read it again? Now that
yes. I will read it over and over in the next few weeks, so you are welcome to hear it again. I plotted murder in the Vancouver airport while waiting at gate D78 for my flight to London. So then she goes on and she's actually talking about how the person she wants to murder is just this small kid who is irritating everyone by running around up and down because the flight has been delayed. So that's who she's thinking about murdering at that moment. And you're getting a little bit of background information that she's part of a school group that is all headed off to London for this 3 weeks that they're going to be overseas. And then actually very quickly, it's on the second page, is that you see her look over at a fellow named Connor, and you realize that Connor is her ex-boyfriend, and he's now sitting with Miriam, his new girlfriend. She's actually sitting on his lap, and that she is now trapped on this school trip with the guy that dumped her and his shiny new girlfriend. And so she basically would rather be just about any place, but she can't get out of this trip. Her parents are making her go because she had already put down the money, and now she's stuck on this trip with him. And so she's not happy about that. In that same chapter, so you're getting a little bit of the history about how they dated, and you're getting a hint that the breakup was not particularly great, and that she's quite upset about it. And then she actually gets introduced to a girl sitting next to her who's a stranger, who's also waiting for the same flight, and they strike up a conversation about the fact that they're both going. So this girl's returning home to England. She's British, and they start sort of getting along. The flight gets delayed again. And so basically the school group is getting up to go do something, and the new girlfriend invites our main character, Kim, to join, which she would, not want to do. And this other girl basically says, no, come hang with me. And her ex-boyfriend is a jerk. So he says, basically, leave it. She doesn't want to come. Trust me, no one's going to miss her with that attitude. Connor strode over and took Miriam's hand without even glancing at me. I flushed. He was right. I was a walking black cloud of doom. I hadn't even bothered to get to know anyone else coming on the trip, and now I was going to be miserable and alone. And then the girl, the stranger that she just met, says, "Tosser," Nikki said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I wasn't certain what it meant, but it sounded both hysterical and insulting, and I burst out laughing. So
What's
then
the
Connor
word? Glitched out.
Tosser.
Tosser. Oh,
Tosser. It's a British term for...
I just didn't hear.
I was going to act that out for those of you who might not know what a tosser is. So basically the girl says, that guy's a loser. I can tell. You can pay me back for correctly identifying him as a wanker by keeping me entertained for the next few hours. And Nikki's smile spreads across her face. We're smart women. We'll think of something to do. So that's the person that's going to get her into trouble. So hopefully at the end of that chapter, I'm pulling you into what are they going to get up to in this layover? And they, in fact, will get into some trouble. So that is the opening chapter of You Owe Me a Murder. So in that whole chapter, I actually have not just tried, but I've introduced you to the main characters that are going to be in this story, which is Nikki and Kim. Those are the two main characters. I've established that they're strangers, that they don't know each other. I've established that Kim has been through this horrible breakup, and you see her as quite shy and a little bit difficult sort of being out there, whereas Nikki is her polar opposite. Nikki is loud, brash, gutsy, willing to sort of do anything, and you can hopefully sort of see that Nikki's going to pull her into some troublesome situations, but also that Nikki's going to probably help her get that guts that she needs as the sort of story is going along. I have actually set up not what the main conflict is going to be, which is going to be a murder plot, but I have set up a conflict that she's trapped on this school trip with her ex-boyfriend, who is a tosser, and his new girlfriend, who's actually quite lovely. But that is this horrible situation that she's in. There's a small group, and she's stuck with him. And as the book unfolds, you're going to find more about the breakup and about why it's even worse that she's actually trapped on this school trip with them. But it's even worse than they broke up. Natasha's already going to kill someone off. I appreciate that, Natasha. At the risk of a little bit of a spoiler, don't worry, he doesn't last long. So I'm proud to say that he won't be causing us a lot of trouble. So in writing that story, I actually played with a whole bunch of different opening chapters. So I initially had the opening chapter when I was writing the draft was the breakup scene. And at the end of the breakup scene, it's her going home and telling her parents, there's no way I'm going on this trip. And her parents basically saying, too bad, like you're going. And that was the opening scene in the initial draft. And then I realized, like, you didn't really need all of that detail. And in fact, I realized that I wanted to hide the real cause of the breakup for a while because that added an extra layer of complexity. So I don't know what draft, but an eventual draft then opened with them in London. So it had her kind of day one, they're getting their guidelines about what they can expect on this trip. And I decided that I didn't like that because it felt like an introduction scene, which is what it was. So you will see it in the book. I think it's chapter 3, but you start seeing all the other people that are on this school trip. And it's important that you know who they all are, but it sort of felt like an opening scene where it was again like, and here we have Natasha, and in the corner is Leslie, and up above we have Marianne. And I felt for the reader like it wasn't going to be clear who all those people were, as well as she was only talking about this stranger that she met on the flight, because Nikki is not on their school trip. Nikki is a British resident who lives there, and so she is not on the school trip. So she would basically just be not on the scene, and I feel like she needs to be on the scene. So version I don't know what is where I landed here, where I had it actually open in the airport. And the first line was after multiple different versions of a first line. So while I'm happy I got all of that in there for clarity, it didn't just come like some beautiful thing. It took me several tries. And as much as I wish it was magic, it wasn't. I think I've had only once or twice where the perfect first line came to me, like really early. And I was like, yes. And I wrote it down and it was like, that's the line that I want to have as my opening line. Usually I do have to dig around for it and it kind of comes much, much later. And this was when I looked back through this flashback scene at the airport, I did have the line that I was plotting murder. And I was like, oh, that's actually kind of an interesting first line. If I saw that in a book, I would read the next line, which is, again, channeling my inner Dawn Moss, what I'm trying to do. So, any questions about opening chapters? Deep thoughts by everyone.
I'm just thinking about the beginnings of all my stories and how much work they've had. I tend to move forward and back. Like I kind of know the event or something that I want to start the story with, but then there's that whole question of how much of the information you're conveying is happening in the moment versus just happened or is about to happen. So it's something to do with the language too, you know? Like how...
Yeah, because you're kind of going back and forth and you're also trying to figure out how much does the reader actually need to know in order to make sense of the story versus being confused. So Bonnie wrote, of course, my favorite question in the chat window, which is just like, so, okay, so how do we do that? I'm trying to think of something clever to say other than I don't actually know, other than you rewrite it and write it again and sort of keep asking yourself, does it have these things in it? And I think some things are easier than others. For me, tone is usually one of the easier things to come up with. So sort of, I have sort of a natural bent. Like for me, even if I'm talking about darker things, I tend to be a little bit funny. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing, but it's my own personal coping mechanism. And it is, I think, what shows up in my books again and again. I think there's a voice that is me. So I will, you know, the first thing I'm kind of looking for is that. Definitely thinking about starting with a character. Again, just one of the versions I know that I had Nikki as the opening chapter where she's looking around the concourse and she's looking for, I don't want to say a victim, but a toy, like someone to entertain. Like, again, Nikki is a little bit of a sociopath, not a little bit, Nikki's a sociopath. And you will, as the book goes on, you're going to discover that in more and more detail. But again, I kind of so initially I had a thing where she was looking around and it read very sort of Hannibal Lecter-y, where she's looking around and she's spotting Kim as the main character, and she's kind of honing in on her and like, oh, this will be my distraction while we wait for the flight. I'm going to toy with this one. Like a cat might just go out and bat around a bird or something. But one, it read a little bit too dark. Two, I realized that ruins all the mystery that right off the bat, that she is like, then the thing is, when is Kim going to figure out that this girl is dangerous? And I realized I kind of liked the idea that we don't know that Kim is dangerous until later in the story. Like, she just seems like an interesting person to pass some time with. I think the reader is going to have some hints, and certainly if they've read the back of the book, they're going to be on to this, that she's probably no good, but it is sort of that. So thinking about what do you want the reader to know and when will they know it might help you get started.
What do...
Natasha, did you have a question?
Well, no, I'm just thinking it's just this fine line between, I always struggle with like how much to let them know versus how much is just backstory and you can take it away and show it later, and when it's all in your mind and how things go and you're in control of everything, it's almost like you have, I would love to have some sort of like an 8-point or a 10-point rule where it's like, oh no, they're only going to get 4 pieces of information and that's all you're allowed. That would be kind of easier.
Well, all right. I'll tell you, you can only have 4 pieces of information. There. Now I've done that for you. But I just totally made that up.
But, we could pursue that because there are categories of information that you have to choose from amongst. Like, is it most important that they understand the main character or something about the main character? Is that the thing that you really want to launch the story with? Or is there a plot set up kind of question that you want to be the first thing or one of the first things that the reader knows about? Or do you want them to know what kind of, futuristic or historical or other special time and place, is that one of the most important things for your story? So, we could make a short list.
Well, and I think part of what you're doing and what Marianne's talking about is making some ideas of priorities. So for me, again, not that I did this when I was writing, because clearly I had to do it 2 or 3 times to get there, but I kind of came down to it, understood that Kim is a bit quirky. So my main character is a bit shy. She's a little bit awkward. Like, it was important that you know that. It was very important that you know that she's on this trip with an ex and that the breakup was ugly. Like, one of the things I realized is you don't need to know why it was ugly. Like, the reader will find it enough that she's trapped on this trip with a boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend, and there's hints about, which hopefully again will pull the reader in, like what exactly happened in that breakup. Because she definitely hints like this wasn't just like, I want to see someone else. Like, that something really bad happened as part of this breakup. And it was important to me that you be introduced to this captivating character that intrigues my main character, that this Nikki is this larger than life person for her. So I am watching the time because, of course, I have some housing people who are going to call me and apparently tell me if I have financing. So,
one of the questions is, what happened before to make this situation happen, right? So
yes.
Decide how much of that you need to share.
Because you always do get the advice that you want to start in the middle of the story to some degree. Like you don't want to necessarily. So I think sometimes we back way up because we need to tell that part of the story. But thinking for ourselves, you know, where is it that I need to start? And what is it that people need to know? And what is it will be okay if they're filled? Like, are people going to be confused? And I think that's a good question. Like, if they don't know why they broke up, does none of this make sense? And the truth, no, like it makes enough sense and I can withhold that. Like, is it confusing if they don't know that Nikki is a sociopath? No, like it's not confusing because this part of the story is told from Kim's point of view and she makes perfect sense. So it's fine that they don't know that. So one of the questions you can ask if you're trying to figure out is, does this make sense? Or even having two different versions of your opening chapter, sharing it with beta readers and seeing if someone's like, I don't understand why she's doing this. Why is she so upset about this? Why? And then you realize like, okay, at least some of that has to be in there. So that's all you have to do. Easy peasy. Just write that first chapter. All right. I am going to wrap us up early, but a reminder, if people ever have specific questions or things you'd like to talk about, just drop me an email in GLIP, and I will be sure to tackle that for an office hours. Or if you have, like you want to have maybe some of your opening paragraphs read and see whether or not if people want to do an A/B testing, so I'm thinking of opening with this line versus this line, I would be more than happy to make that an opening thing. So put that in your hat and think about it. All right, everybody, take care and have a good Wednesday.
Luck, Eileen.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.